Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. And thanks to everyone who's with us. I'm just very enthused and grateful for this day. I appreciate the CSA team for offering it to us, and I'm really honored to be a part of it. Thank you. So I think that's my cue for me to share my screen and get us started. So thanks everyone for joining this session in particular. We are going to talk about listening like it's your superpower. And in addition to being a professional certified coach, I'm also an advanced grief recovery method specialist. And I have really realized in recent years that training has even enhanced my listening skills and abilities and superpowers beyond what I learned in my coach training. So I'm excited to bring you some of the secrets from the grief recovery method that I think are really valuable part of our toolkit. So as mentioned, in addition to being a professional certified coach, I have two other certifications that are specific to grief. One is that I'm advanced grief let me just read them because they're so long and wordy. Advanced Certified Grief Recovery Method Specialist. That's from the Grief Recovery Institute, and that's the methodology from which I'm going to draw today's content. And I'm a certified grief and end of life coach from an organization called Coaching at End of Life. And before that, I had a full career in talent management and performance improvement, which of course shares many of the skills that we use as coaches and caregivers as well. So I wanted to start by just reminding you what the description for this particular session is and let you know what brought this topic to my mind. And it was really two incidents, one from the very beginning of my coaching career and one more recent. The one from the beginning of my career was that when I was in coach training with that organization, Coaching at End of Life, we did a practice session where I was playing the coach and another person was playing the griever. And really what I did through my entire session was just listen with, active listening techniques like facial expressions and things like that. And at the end, we came to the end of that demo and I thought, oh my gosh, I have failed that. I didn't do a thing as a coach. And to my surprise, the folks that were teaching and mentoring me about how to be a coach, they were raving about how amazing my listening skills were. So it was a funny disconnect, but it was really my first lesson in how much grievers, and as we're going to talk about today, I think people who have been affected by suicide really need and value that particular skill. And that brings me to the second story, which is just that I've noticed in recent sessions with my grief recovery clients that the very similar thing happens. The sessions where I spend most of my time just listening and holding space is what they find most valuable, right? So yes, I have homework worksheets, and yes, we discuss the homework, and yes, I provide other kinds of support, but the amount of time spent listening, that's what people really reference as being, as adding a lot of value. So those two things came together in my mind to say, hey, there's a lot embedded in the grief recovery method that's different than what we may learn as coaches and other kinds of caring professions. And so that's the genesis of today's topic. So who is this session for? Because there's a wide variety of people on this eSummit today, just wanted to let you know that I'm addressing this to anyone who wants to provide or does provide personal or professional support to someone who has been affected by suicide. So for those of us that are sitting on the caregiver side, the supporter side, we might be a coach, counselor, social worker, other kind of professional like that, healthcare provider, that kind of caregiver, law enforcement, judicial, other kind of public and community workers. Or you may be a friend, family member, or a volunteer who just has a heart for those who have been affected by suicide. Now, on the person in the other chair, the person to whom we want to extend the care might be someone who struggles with suicidal ideation and or planning and or taking actions along that line, might be someone who has attempted suicide and survived, and it might be just someone else who knows, cares for, and or is grieving someone who died by suicide. So hopefully that means that all of us are in the right place. And I think what I'm going to present to you today is hopefully very valuable to everyone in all of those categories. And I just want to start by expressing my heartfelt thanks for you. Whoever you are, you're already a superhero just because you have a heart for this work. And I want to make reference to the fact that this is scary work. I have worked with a client, a grief recovery client, who was suicidal. And I just know what a level of responsibility that is. And I'm sure each one of you on the call who either has someone like that in your life or is a caring and supporting person, professionally or personally, I know you feel that burden of responsibility too. So thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest and commitment to the topic and for doing what we're doing today to level up our skills and always do better and better in this work. I want to take a moment to be very clear about what this session is about and is not about. So as referenced in the description of the session and in my introduction already, this lesson is purely about the skills and experiences and practices that I have experienced as someone who learned and practices the grief recovery method and how that can level up our listening skills. So today is about how to be a more skillful listener. And I think I'm bringing you tips and techniques that you haven't heard in other places because I know I have not. But I also want to be really clear about what it's not today. What I'm going to be addressing today is not what to listen for when you're working with those affected by suicide, whatever your type of client may be. And of course, they may not be paying clients, but we're not talking about what to listen for or what to do if you hear something that fits those criteria. So I have had experiences in that situation, but I am not here as an expert telling you what to listen for when you're working with people affected by suicide, nor what to do in terms of referrals or next steps if you hear something that catches your ear. So I would like to ask everyone just to put some kind of thumbs up reaction next to your name, if you would, just to be clear that we're all on the same page, because I think it's important and I don't want you walking away thinking I'm providing a different opportunity or skill set for you than I am. So Mike, just keep tabs and hopefully we'll see some thumbs up letting us know that everyone's on the same page. And another sort of cautionary word similar to the slide before, there's a wide variety of professionals and individuals on this call. And I want to acknowledge that each profession has a different set of standards, competencies, ethical requirements. So what I'm sharing with you is from the perspective of coaching and the grief recovery method, but I'm leaving the responsibility with you to filter that through what you know about the requirements, legal or otherwise, in your profession. So listen to what I'm sharing, consider whether it applies to you, decide whether or not to make it a part of your practice, and then take action. But again, that responsibility is with you and requires a level of your discernment to decide if this works in your profession. I'm interested in some more thumbs up about that. Thanks, guys. All right, so that said, what will we cover today? I do want to spend a short time just making sure we have a shared understanding about what is grief, what is the grief recovery method, and why that matters to us when we're talking about people affected by suicide. Once we have that groundwork, just want to start by setting the stage of what's missing from the listening that we do in our everyday lives, and why is it that our skill set as a listener, when we're a friend, when we're a colleague, when we're on the street meeting a new person, how does that type of listening not quite measure up to what we need to be doing when we're in that session or time with people who are affected by suicide, and how we can replace what's missing. Then I'm going to share with you the way we start every relationship and every session in the grief recovery method, which is with 3 shared commitments. And I think that really lays the groundwork for the type of listening spaces that we're talking about. So I want to share that with you. There's also another great tool that I got from the grief recovery method that is basically a word picture that instantly reminds me what stance I'm supposed to take when I'm in the listening position. And again, I think that will be helpful to you. Looking forward to sharing it. The other thing I learned from the grief recovery method is 3 techniques that are very common, both socially and professionally. And I want to share with you what I've learned about how those might actually be counterproductive to the kind of listening we're talking about. And then finally, in case all of this piques your interest, I want to let you know how you can learn more about the grief recovery method, how you can experience it for yourself, or how you can refer your clients to that if that's a tool that they need. So we'll get started. I want to share with you the definition of grief from the grief recovery method. And this is amazing. It really expanded my way of thinking and my perspective about grief. I hope it does the same for you. So you've seen the definition on the screen, and let me flip through two of the key parts of that. So first of all, the Grief Recovery Institute is the first place I ever learned that grief is not the name of one emotion. The experience of grief is actually when we feel multiple, often conflicting emotions about any life event, change, or loss. So, let's say you had been in a caregiver situation for an aging parent and they passed away. You would feel the emotions that most of us expect you to feel: sadness, missing them, maybe you regret some things about your relationship, but you may also feel some other emotions that you're not as comfortable with, like relief that the caregiving is over, relief that the person is no longer in pain. Sometimes we have some conflicting emotions that are not safe to share, we feel, with other people because they're not always understood by our culture. But it is important to realize that grief is a confusing, very impactful set of conflicting emotions. So I hope that's a helpful tip for you. Secondly, the grief recovery method made me realize that grief can be caused by any change or life event. So again, this really broadens our perspective to understand that in some cases, for some people, happy events like a marriage can cause grief. Like a retirement, like kids going to college or graduating from college. You can see how each of those experiences, while they offer a hello to something we are really excited about and really interested to step into, they also contain a goodbye to other things that we really care about. So for the example I always use for myself is that I got married at age 40. I was thrilled about that, had a fairy tale romance and wedding. And then pretty soon I realized I had lost control of my finances. I had lost control of my social time. I had lost control of my private time. A lot of things that I had gotten very used to in my 40 years of running my own show. And so I really connect with this idea that any change has the potential to cause grief. It does not always cause grief, but it might. So that's good to know just as you're walking around the world with other people, because we're all carrying around a backlog for all those changes that no one ever told us we were allowed to grieve, and we didn't know how to grieve them. So that's a helpful background for everyone you meet, but also those of us who care about this work. So next, I just want to let you know what the grief recovery method is. The grief recovery method was invented more than 40 years ago by a gentleman named John James, who was in devastating, debilitating grief, an experience I can relate to, and maybe many of you on the call can. And he could not find any solutions that worked for him. So basically, he did what anyone with a great entrepreneurial spirit did. He figured it out for himself, and he codified it, and he started sharing it with the world. And one of the key distinctions that he realized is that grief is not a broken head, it's a broken heart, which is why that's part of their logo. So many of the solutions or support systems for grief in the rest of the culture are intellectually based, right? Read a book, attend talk therapy, attend a group, support group where people are just reiterating their stories over and over. Well, those are intellectual activities, and they're not effective at getting down into the heart. But the grief recovery has been gathering data for a number of years now that we can now proudly say that we are an evidence-based program. We have data proving that our activities, they're not rocket science, I'll tell you that as a little preview, but they really are effective at getting us into the heart and helping us understand what we need to know about our grief and how we can let go of it. So we have lots of books, all of which are available on Amazon for everybody. I just want to say a brief caveat. The problem with books is that often without a coach, you may not implement the actual work. And then you have a knowing doing gap, which does not actually serve to resolve your grief, right? Because you've stayed in the headspace and maybe not had the bravery to step into that heart space and do that challenging work on your own. So I highly recommend working with a certified grief recovery specialist. And in order to do that, we have all the logos on the right-hand side of the screen show that we have both in-person programs for the specialists that choose to still offer those. And we have a growing number of specialists that are certified to deliver these programs via the internet. For instance, I, as a practitioner, I no longer see anyone in person except on very rare special occasions. My clients and I both love that we can do this work virtually. It's so convenient, and it creates a similar healing, perfectly safe space in which to do this work. Okay, just want to tell you a little bit more about the grief recovery method again, so we have a shared understanding. It is not counseling. I don't have a counseling degree. Some grief recovery method specialists do, but those of us who don't, we're not trying to pass ourselves off as a counselor. And I also want to make some important distinctions about counseling. Number one, note that not all counselors and therapists, even if they're trained from that perspective, have expertise or interest in dealing with grief. So that's a good reason to look for a grief recovery method specialist if you know you want to work specifically on your grief. Because the experience of counseling can be more like chemotherapy. It's kind of like a general systems approach. You might talk about lots of things going on in your past, present, and future. I compare the grief recovery method to radiation or laser therapy in contrast to chemotherapy. We know we're there to talk specifically about your grief. We're going to talk about the life events that caused your grief one at a time and work through the grief recovery method steps for each one of those to make sure we definitely get healing for each one of those issues. The other thing the grief recovery method is it's not coaching. It's an educational program. When I'm working with my folks, I'm their guide on the side, and I'm teaching them a tool and encouraging them to practice it, providing accountability for that. It's much more directive than pure coaching. So I call myself a grief coach, but when I'm using this tool, I'm actually not officially in the coaching hat, although I certainly use coaching techniques. And what it is, as I kind of described when I was calling it laser therapy, we're going to talk specifically about the events or relationships that are causing grief, help the person understand their feelings. That's what gets it down into the heart. We practice using emotion words, many of which most of us have forgotten because we're not invited to talk about our emotions in everyday life, at least not the challenging ones. We help them identify what they need to communicate about that experience and provide that safe place for them to communicate those things. That's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. That's where the listening skills come in. And again, of course, the specialist / coach can help them stay accountable. We all know it's helpful to have an appointment to show up to in order to complete the assignment that you've committed to. So thank you for giving me time to lay that groundwork, because I just want you to know where these tools and techniques are coming from. And finally, let's just make the connection. How on earth does grief relate to suicide? Well, for some of us, that might be a no-brainer, but I wanted to think through it. And to be honest, these are the three I came up with. Michael, I want to invite you, if there's any others you can think of, I'm happy for that contribution. But number one, I am personally quite sure that life events that caused grief to me, they simply have to be the root cause of the types of pain and experiences that lead to thoughts or actions about suicide. I'm not saying that as a professional expert about suicide, but I just know how heavy the burden of unresolved grief is. And depending on your personality and your mental state, it could definitely lead to suicide. Number two, people who survived a suicide attempt, I'm assuming and expecting, have any number of griefs to unpack. And as they get more healing about that, we protect them from future attempts. And thirdly, people who have lost a loved one to suicide need to address their grief about that loss. Gosh, I just had a fourth one of my own that popped into my head and then I lost it. So we might be adding to this list. I invite you guys to add to our list in the chat, but that's the link that I can see that brings us here today. And Michael's not saying anything, so I guess he thinks this short list is at least sufficient.
Well, also that people that are experiencing the grief often feel guilty for experiencing the grief.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. So it's a complicated subject. Clearly, we're boiling it down, but this is the what's in it for me. Why are we here talking about this? And so with that groundwork, let me jump into what's missing from listening in our everyday lives. First of all, I'm going to share. Okay, so this is the section where I have two things that I absolutely know to be proven to be true and I don't have the data points to back them up. So Michael will recognize the first one. As we were talking about this session, Michael told me that he has a stat that proves that the longer we listen to someone who's thinking about attempting suicide, the less likely they are to make that attempt. I forgot to ask Michael to find me the stat. I'm not going to put you on the spot here, but if we can find it, we can share it with these folks later. But that's why the listening is so important, and it's important that we do it better than we do in our everyday life. Michael also told me that Coaching Suicide Awareness, before it was a nonprofit, before it took on any formal activities, was created simply as a place for people to share their stories as it related to suicide. Because again, our culture does not offer many safe spaces for that. So God bless you, Michael. God bless the team and everyone who's engaged with it. And I want to point out the second thing that I didn't look up my data point is the Grief Recovery Institute did a survey a number of years ago. And they asked, let's say they asked 100,000 people. First, they asked general people, do you think grievers want to talk about their loss? And a ridiculously high percentage, like 95%, 99% said, no, don't bring up their loss. They don't want to be reminded. They don't want to talk about it. That's the first half of the coin. Then they asked people who were actually considered themselves grievers, do you want to talk about your loss? And like 99.9% of the grievers said, yes, I'm dying to talk about my loss, and I can't find a place to do that. Like nobody wants to hear it. Nobody knows how to listen in a way that lets me say it. So this is something that relates the grieving to the CSA, Coaching Suicide Awareness. And I think that's an important parallel. And the stats from the Grief Recovery Institute, I think, are very compelling. So it's funny, I think people don't want to bring up topics because they're afraid they'll remind the griever about their loss. I just want to remind you, the griever is thinking about their loss 100%, 24/7. You're not bringing up anything they're not already thinking about. And so if you offer them a space to talk about it, that's a real gift you can give. So now to my other key points about what's missing from everyday listening. I'm starting with this box on the bottom of the screen about the 3 levels of listening, because I want to acknowledge that there's tons of great teaching about listening, particularly for those of us who are coaches, I'm sure for counselors and therapists and lots of other professions that I don't know behind the curtain. But I want to acknowledge those are really important, and I think they're the foundation, and that's why in so many of these professions, we get very serious learning about them. And I want to share with you the key points that are more sort of layperson or more just from my own professional experience that I don't think you'll see in any other book. But this is how I've started describing one of the service that I offer in this role to my clients. Number 1, a safe place. Again, many of us in many professions are offering a safe place. Number 2, it's a safe place in which my client, the griever, the person affected by suicide, gets to say exactly what they want to say. Exactly. Colorful language is welcome in my room if you need to use it, right? I encourage people to say exactly what they want to say. That's what helps get the emotions out of the heart and processed and completed. To say it exactly how they want to say it. Again, okay, I'm going to take a risk here. I won't use the colorful language, but I'll give you a sense of what I tell my clients. What you want to say could be everything from thank you to F you. Again, this is the place to say the things that we hold inside because we're ashamed about them. And shame is just, it just eats us away from the inside. So I want people to say everything they want to say, even the stuff they're scared to say, the stuff they would never want to admit to their mother, never want to admit to God. Let's get it again out and into the air so it can go away. So this is the kind of safe space that I'm talking about. And ideally, let them say it for as long as they want to say it. So I think a lot of grievers, and again, maybe people affected by suicide, they end up telling the same story over and over and over again. I think part of that is because there's no safe space to say everything they want to say the first time through. And we'll talk about in a minute what some of the things in our current listening techniques are blocking them from that experience. But in my experience, if they get to say everything they want to say and take whatever duration they need to do that, that's a very healing experience. And I can almost guarantee you not one they have found anywhere else. Now, the parentheses, to the extent possible, that's because most of us work in a session environment, right? We have 50 minutes. So sometimes we can't always give them as much time as they want, but there may be times where extending the session is warranted. Another thing that's helpful is to be clear about how much time they do have and ask them whether they want time signals from you so that they can, if they need to modify the duration of their conversation, they can. But I want you to think about this and think about your own life as a friend, as a spouse, as a coworker, as a receiver of services. Have you ever had a conversation in your everyday life that meets this criteria? I would argue no, and I can tell you why I say no. It's partly from my own personal experience. As you can tell, I'm a very verbal person. I'm a pretty expressive person. I like those conversations where you're both having so much fun about it that you keep interrupting each other and finishing each other's sentences. But that's not an effective listening space for the kind of therapeutic work that we're talking about. So I would be interested to hear what you think about what I think is missing from everyday listening and whether you concur that that's true. Sadly, I think it's missing from some of our professional listening as well. So that's why I wanted to share some of these behind the curtain secrets from the grief recovery method. Okay, so now we've talked about what's missing from listening for many grievers and those affected by suicide. So now let's talk about creating a safe space. Again, this is content that many professions have some training in. And when I got to the grief recovery method, they've distilled it down to 3 commitments. And our habit is to, number 1, make these commitments clear at the start of the overall relationship. And number 2, recite these commitments at the beginning of every session. So it's a little bit of a different approach, and I think the language is helpful. So these are the 3 commitments. And on the one side, I've showed you what are the language in the grief recovery method. And then usually I have my own sort of subheading or interpretation or layman's language that I also like to use to help clarify the concepts. So the first concept, the first commitment is total emotional honesty. And the distinction I like to make for my clients is you don't have to tell me all the gory details, particularly if there's a traumatic event that we're working on your grief about. Our grief recovery approach is not that you have to relive every detail of that situation, that experience, nor do you have to say every detail out loud to me. But I'm going to encourage you to be honest with me and with yourself about all the things that happened, at a high level headline level of detail at least, and more importantly, how it impacted you emotionally. So if you're telling me a story about a trauma situation, again, I don't need to hear all this, the blow by blow, play by play details, but I definitely want you to be honest about how it affected you. And that might be something that a person has never expressed to anyone before. So that's, again, why we're creating that safe space. If they share the details, they definitely need the safe space in which to do that. And I invite people to share the details if that's what works for them. I'm a highly verbal processor and a highly detail-oriented person. So when I'm in the speaker's chair, the one receiving the counseling or the support, I like to say everything I can think of. But this is a place for people who have different styles to choose not to share some or all of the details, but again, to make sure we're being honest about how it impacted us at the time and since. Okay, so the second one is absolute confidentiality. These other 2 don't require a whole lot of explanation. Absolute confidentiality, my little tagline is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But I will tell you that one distinction about the grief recovery method that might be true for some of you in your role as listeners and supporters, you know what? I'm going to save that thought because I have a whole slide for it next. So forget I said anything. So absolute confidentiality means what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. And uniqueness and individuality, for those of us who are old enough to remember this reference, that really just means free to be you and me. So again, we'll get into the details about how we can create a safe space for people to just be who they are with no comparison and critique or judgment. But that's what that means. So I'll tell you that admittedly, sometimes I feel kind of funny when I reiterate these these 3 commitments at the start of every session. It can get to feel repetitive. Sometimes I quiz my folks and they start to remember what they are within a few sessions. But I often ask them at the top of the session, which of these resonates with you today and why? And so I invite you to think about that. Which of these 3 commitments resonates with you and why? And if you'd like to share in the chat, that would be great. And also think about this. What if you started opening your sessions with these 3 commitments or some other set of 3 commitments that are appropriate for how you want to create the safe space? I invite you to think about, how would that change the way you listen? And how would that change the way they share? And how would that change the results you're getting together? So again, if you'd like to share about that in the chat, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, take that with you as maybe a homework reflection question. Okay, this is the comment I almost made a minute ago. One of the most powerful ways to create the safe space is to be the one that goes first. So in the grief recovery method, one of our distinctions from other professions like counseling is that I always go first. I'm going to share my grief stories before I ask them to share their grief stories. I'm going to demonstrate the homework, including my results in answering the same questions, before I ask them to step into that homework. And so I think this may not be applicable in every suicide type conversation, but consider about whether it is. Is there something that you can share before you share about yourself to earn their trust and to prove how committed you are to that safe space before you invite them to share? So again, food for thought. Michael, you haven't jumped in at all, and I think I'm going pretty fast. I just thought this might be a good time to pause and see if there's anything to interject.
It is. One of the questions essentially was asking, is there a distinguishable difference that we need to know about between feelings and emotions?
If there is, I am not an expert on that, so I will not try to answer that. I know, I haven't read it yet, but I know Brene Brown has a book that's called something like the Encyclopedia of Emotions or things like that, where she lists all the emotion words and has details about them. That's one possible resource. I'm sure our counseling and therapist friends probably have a lot of information about that. I don't have any. Michael, do you have any to share?
No, I was reading something about that recently, and they said, for the purposes of this book, I'm going to make them the same.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So let's do that for this session too. But were you going to have another comment?
Well, another one was, probably she didn't say this, but based on the Paul Ekman work on reading micro expressions, and there's now bots, robot programs that can do that. So I'm just kind of just making that observation for my friend in South Africa who's commenting on that as a resource. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great resource. Because, we all, I'm assuming, come from a background of active listening. And I think that's one of the ways we can be active listening, right? In fact, that goes back to those 3 levels of listening and observing for what's not being said, listening for kind of what's in the space, even if it's not being verbalized. So yes, that sounds like an incredible tool. Not the bot, but let's as humans continue to hone our own skill set in that area.
Okay, yeah, that's it for now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we'll move into, what does superpower listening look like? And I'm excited about this because this is the word picture that I learned from the grief recovery method and have run with ever since. Because you know how it is when you see a picture and boom, you got it. Picture's worth 1,000 words. I think this one counts. So what is that? You can answer in the chat if you want to. Okay, well, I'd only paused for a moment, but basically this is a heart with ears and tape over its mouth. Does that give you a word picture of what superpower listening looks like, or what? So this is useful for me as a practitioner because I just need to, look at this on my wall or say that simple phrase, heart with ears and tape over its mouth, and boom, I basically know what my role is, right? And I can step into it. And I use this picture with my clients too, because don't forget, if I'm sharing, they have to be my listening partner at one point. So I'm teaching them the superpower listening skills, and I'm teaching them what they can expect from me in that safe space. And actually, I don't know if this is the official grief recovery method way, but often what I do is I don't introduce this idea until the second or third session, so that then we can look back and compare what that everyday listening looks like and sort of think together about whether or not it was effective, and contrast it to what this kind of listening is going to look and feel like, right? Because it's different. Again, most of us don't have friends, partners, colleagues that listen like this on a regular basis. We might have a few outstanding stars in our life, but again, this is something you can teach your friends, partners, and business associates if you want to level up your listening for each other. And here's how I describe the sharing protocol that's unique for our grief recovery sessions, which again, I think applies to when you're having this type of listening session with your suicide, folks affected by suicide. So the first thing is duct tape over the mouth. This is not a time of discussion. This is time for that speaker to say exactly what they want to say, exactly how they want to say it, for ideally as long as they want to say it. So what that means is those of us in the listener chair, we refrain from interrupting or responding. Now, granted, I cheat a little bit, like I'll allow myself to say cool, or oh my gosh, or that's horrible, or, you know, a very brief, one syllable, very short phrase. Again, that's part of the active listening. So they know I'm listening and registering the import of what they're saying. But I also do a lot of that just with facial expressions or, you know, hand signals or something like that. Anything that is said should definitely not look anything like analyzing, critiquing, or judging, comparing or contrasting, interrupting to say, oh my gosh, I had the same experience because you didn't, and it's not relevant right now. So again, these are the habits we carry around in our everyday listening and communications and conversations. So those are things to practice not doing in this type of listening session. And actually, in the grief recovery method, we stay very pure to our grief recovery methodology. We don't, and I'm not saying you have to do that clearly, but the idea here is don't mix and match. Don't be doing part counseling, part spiritual guidance, part 12-step, right? Like, this is not the instructional part of a session that you're having. This is not even the conversation intellectualizing part, right? So none of those other inputs are relevant when you're doing your superpower listening. They may be relevant at other parts of your session or other parts of your relationship with this person. But if you're listening, just actually be listening at this incredible level for as long as you need to be. One other thing I learned from the grief recovery method that is so interesting to me is that certain active listening techniques, and actually these might be customs more so than active listening techniques. And let me just say, are there any other Southern women on the call here? Because this might be mostly for us, but it's going to hit a few others of you too. These are a few habits that are probably so ingrained in you from the time you were a toddler that they might be hard not to do. But let me have you reconsider these customs. Number one, reaching out to touch somebody. Again, a Southern woman cannot see somebody else cry or even sneeze without wanting to touch them, hug them, say, bless your heart, maybe in some cases. But actually, when the speaker receives that touch, it serves to shut down the experience they're having. It's like an off button. So this might be something you've learned elsewhere. Experiment with it. I'm saying if you were taught that touch is therapeutic, and I'm sure there are situations in which it is, again, just consider this, maybe experiment with refraining from doing it. It might be super hard for you because again, this was definitely in my repertoire before I got this training, but see how that affects the person in the speaker chair for you. I'm using the word client, although again, it may not be a paying client for you, but yeah, just again, we're trying to give them that space where they get to have their full emotional and verbal experience without us doing anything to interrupt it. So it just runs along those lines. Similarly, who on the call would not pass someone a tissue if they started crying or sniffling? But think about it. Even when your intentions are good, passing a tissue, offering a tissue essentially says, let's not cry here, right? So again, you're having the effect of shutting them down from feeling the emotions. And I think, at least in my grief recovery sessions, and possibly in your sessions with those who've been affected by suicide, we want them to feel the emotions at a bearable level, right? Again, we're not trying to toss anyone back into trauma, but we want them to have those emotions leak out a little bit at a time. And if you pass a tissue, you might be sending a message that's contrary to that. Similarly, I refrain from wiping my own eyes because, again, the behavior I'm modeling is it's not okay to cry here. So consider letting your own tears flow, both when you're telling your own story, if you choose to go first, and if something in their story touches you, because that's modeling the behavior that tears are okay here. I'm going to go first. I'm going to cry. You're welcome to do that too. Michael, let me pause again. And before I move into my conclusion, were there any questions or comments about anything we've covered recently?
Yes. Going back to the Vegas point, what's in Vegas stays in Vegas. For grief recovery, what your method is advocating here. What is the thought behind that? The person's asking a question. Is it not better to always have an open aspect about what you're experiencing and not be limited by a confidentiality an axiom that says no, what's in this session has to stay in this session? So I think that kind of communicates to me, maybe it's not okay in this method to talk about it later because what's here stays here.
Well, thank you for letting me know that that's not as clear as I would like it to be. The genesis of what that means is both parties in my grief recovery session, and again, in your sessions dealing with people affected by suicide, both parties are going to share very intimate details about their life if they choose to, and they're going to share information about their emotional life that they don't share with many other people, I would guess. And so what I'm saying is, what happens in the session stays in the session for the purposes of confidentiality. So for instance, I don't go around telling anybody what my clients have shared with me in confidence. And again, because I'm going first, I'm sharing stuff with them in confidence, and I don't want them to tell other people about it. Does that clarify, Michael? That's what I mean.
Yeah, I think so.
And while you're pausing, let me also say, if the person chooses to go tell other people about their own experience, that's fine. If I get enlightened and choose to go tell my husband, I got a new revelation when I shared something about myself in my session, that's fine. But not to, cross share the other person's personal information. That's probably the best explanation.
Yeah. So maybe I'm just a little bit too much, Mr. Ethics, when we talk about confidentiality, because it's always one of my buttons here. But another question was, so how, I'm going to use the word useful, is it to share what you're experiencing on social media?
Again, so the idea is, if that person wants to go on social media and say, I had a great grief recovery session with Jinnie, I discovered this about myself, I feel less this as a result, they can tell the whole world what they've learned about themselves. I don't go on social media and say, you wouldn't believe what my client Carla learned in her session today. She told me all about this traumatic experience and how she was feeling about it, and I'm telling you, right? Does that add a level of clarity, Michael?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, good. Mm-hmm.
And in fact, if anyone chooses to follow me on social media, you will occasionally see testimonials from my current clients because they say amazing things during our session that let me know how it's impacting them. if they say something very pithy, I will ask them if I can put it on social media, right? It's usually about how our work is impacting them. It's not about their actual experiences, but I always get permission. So maybe in addition to what happens in the session stays in the session, we could say, except if you get permission to share the other person's information.
I just posted in the chat, Jinnie, your website, and that's where you would welcome feedback because, in this environment where we've got over 400 people registered, we're kind of holding the chat down tight. I'm not just saying that to you, I'm saying to, all of the 79 people that are participating at the moment. So I just put in the chat your website so that people can comment to you here. But yeah, land the plane and bring us in. Tell us more about what you do and how people can interact with you best and get help from you if they want it. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are a person, let's see how to get this to advance. Oh my goodness. Okay. So if you are a person who wants to experience the grief recovery method for yourself, either because you're a practitioner and you have your own grief to complete so that you can be better in your role. Maybe you are a person who's personally impacted by suicide, either as someone who struggles with those thoughts, plans, and actions, or someone who's attempted and survived. These are a couple of ways to get experience and or certified in the grief recovery method. And again, if you're a practitioner or someone affected by suicide, you may want to refer them to this opportunity. So I'm not going to go deep into this table. Actually, I invite you to send me an email if you want it. I will share this table as well as recap some of the key points from the listening superpowers. Basically, you have what I've listed here are two different options. One is to go directly to the Grief Recovery Method Institute. If you go through their program, not only can you resolve one of your own griefs, you can also get certified if you're a person that wants to use this method with your clients. So for instance, my clients who come do that work with me as a client, they're not certified and authorized to go lead anyone else through the program. So if you want to lead someone through grief recovery, you go to the Grief Recovery Institute and get certified. But of course, you'll also learn the tool for yourself and start using it on yourself. The two bottom rows indicate the services you can get from me. I offer a 3-month program and I offer a 6-month program. So this is for a person who wants to experience the grief recovery method, but not necessarily get certified to do it, to lead anyone else through it. So in the 3 months, you would resolve 3 of your own grief issues, past or current. In this 6-month program, we can mix and match a little more. We have a little more time, so you can resolve between 1 to 3 grief issues and maybe get some coaching for another topic. And if you are a coach who's seeking certification at the ACC level, I could give you mentor coaching for your ACC certification. And of course, I could coach you about how to infuse these kind of techniques in your coaching practice, even though you would not go away certified as a grief recovery method specialist. I hope that's not confusing. I think the table is pretty clear about what it gets you and what it doesn't. So with that, I wanted to move into any other questions that we haven't that we have remaining, Michael.
Actually, I don't think so. Just checking here.
If you folks in the audience, I love that we have like 80 people here. That's wonderful. Feel free to drop new questions in the chat. I would also welcome your feedback, quite honestly, as a presenter and as someone that I would like to know how valuable this information is for you, whether this presentation has legs for other audiences. I just have 2 more slides. They will take milliseconds each.
Sure, go ahead.
To end as we began with my sincere thanks for all of you that have a heart for this work. I know you already have superpowers. If you're interested in leveling up your listening, I hope this provided some valuable ideas and things for you to try. And just thank you for the work you're already doing and that you have a heart to keep doing. And I just also wanted to show this slide that has my email address again, if this is easier for folks to see and write down. So that's all I have, Michael. I came in a little bit under an hour, so we have a few minutes for whatever you have to do, and whether we're taking a break between speakers, you take it from here. I'll be a listener.
Right. No, we're going to take a short break here. And there's Nadine. Nadine, you want to take it from here?
Jinnie, that was just absolutely phenomenal. And I just think everybody here can relate to some sort of grief in their life. We all have had loss. We all have had people who have, left our lives and went to the other side. And we're just so grateful that you're here today. And I just want to thank you for sharing so much about the grief recovery method, the definition of grief, all that you went through, the strategies, the implementations, the actions that we can take moving forward. It was absolutely phenomenal. So I thank you so much for that. I love the fact, one thing that really stood out to me was us going first. No matter what relationship we have, whether it's clients, whether it's just with a friend relationship, somebody in our family, when we're vulnerable and authentic and we share our stories first from the heart, it allows other people to also, show up and be vulnerable with us. And that leads towards healing. And I think that's something that's so powerful. I just wanted to reiterate that to everybody, just remembering to share with your heart, to go first, to not be afraid, to step into that love and into that part of your heart. I just wanted to share just 30 seconds. Also, there was a question about feelings versus emotions. I was thinking a little bit about that as you were talking, and experience that I have with that. So when we have feelings, it's generally something that's experienced consciously, that we can experience consciously. Emotions, on the other hand, can be experienced consciously or subconsciously, that generally is rooted in some sort of experience we've gone through, generally from childhood. An example that I had, so the 6 basic emotions, just to go very briefly into this, are sadness, happiness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. So those are the basic. Obviously, there's many hundreds of other ones that we could also talk about. But an example would be love is an emotion that makes you feel trust. So we feel trust. Love is the emotion. That was an example. So I just want to thank you again, Jinnie, for sharing your insights, your wisdom, your knowledge. Absolutely fabulous. And it's great to have you here. So thank you so much again.